My name is Ahmed Darrat, and I'm a market lead at Cityfi, an urban change management consulting firm based here in Culver City. And I want to thank everybody today for having me to talk about integrating empathy into our mobility ecosystems. And so I want to start the day by talking a little bit about myself. My primary identity is that I'm an immigrant and refugee. My family comes from Libya, where my father was a political dissident to the Muammar Gaddafi regime. When I was 2, my family moved to America and settled in Lexington, Kentucky. However, in order to get into the country, we had to rely on other Arab countries providing us with immigration documents. So my father and my siblings and I came into the country with Sudanese passports, and my father came into the country with Iraqi passports. And as you might imagine, my father, once we decided we wanted to settle down, decided that he was going to go for a permanent residency through a political asylum process. And so a little bit after this, Desert Storm happened. And as you might imagine, that sped up our process quite a bit. And so we ended up in court in Cincinnati, Ohio, where a State Department attorney argued that that my mother should stay in the country to take care of my siblings and I, while my father should be deported to face what was a most certain execution in Libya. But a government judge intervened at the time and ruled that our family should stay as a whole, and that we would receive our green cards and later receive our US citizenship. And so as I moved through my life, I then decided that I was going to study engineering. And from a professional perspective, I still consider myself a transportation engineer. I spent 10 years working my way up in the Seattle Department of Transportation from an associate engineer to reading the entire signal world at the city of Seattle, where I was responsible for signal design, maintenance, and operations. As engineers, we're regularly taught to use science and investigative techniques and apply them to real-world applications. But somehow in the US, for transportation engineers, this has turned into building monstrosities like this. And so I want to kind of start talking about how we build in empathy. And so one of my favorite concepts related to empathy is this idea of omotenashi, which is a Japanese word that roughly translates to the spirit of selfless hospitality. And Japanese culture holds this concept in very high regard and looks to every opportunity to apply it. And a great story that I've heard about this is on a Malcolm Gladwell podcast where he was working with Lexus on talking about their vehicles. They told the story about a design engineer that was responsible for their infotainment systems, who took a part-time job as a florist, working with people that had been in the industry for quite some time, so that he could better understand how to present something in a visual manner where people would love it and accept it as if it was a gift. And so your question might start to ask, what does this have to do with mobility? And so in transportation, we regularly think about the choices that people make. But all too often, we think about it from a very pretentious perspective about forcing mode choice on people and telling them like children that they need to eat their vegetables. But rarely do we ever think about the frame in which people make those decisions, and not only how they affect those modes, but how the modes affect them and the impact that those decisions have on them in their day-to-day lives. And in a sense, when we want to be empathetic in a situation with transportation, it's not just about being human-centered, but about being community-centered to think about the system as a whole. And this isn't the first time that anybody has thought about this. Very recently, locally here, LADOT has laid out the principles of transportation happiness. And it looks at external factors and internal factors. And some of those internal factors are things like freedom to get around and freedom from disruption, right? But then also they look at external factors that are freedom from harm, freedom to connect, freedom from exclusion, which are mostly things that happen to people rather than choices that people make. And this isn't something that's a brand new concept or a brand new idea. We actually know what good design is. We know how to think about things empathetically. And I love this picture from Seattle because it shows that in 1940, people were literally jumping on top of cars complaining about unsafe streets. And when we look at transportation safety and zoom into the modern world, what you start to see is that a city like Seattle has a great Vision Zero plan where we recognize that road violence is indeed a public health epidemic, and that we need to scientifically understand human behavior and how we make decisions in redesigning our streets. Very similar to the way that we do with the pandemic today, is that we make very educated decisions guided by the CDC and science. And so they look at things like in Vision Zero, like human perception at speed, and recognizing that people have faults and in human behavior, it has errors. And so then we also look at things that are happening outside of the vehicle and recognizing that as we increase speed by 20 miles per hour, our survival rate goes from 10%, goes from 90% to 10%. And in reality, these are real people, and they're all too often people in communities of color that are dying in our streets every day, and that they have valuable lives and families that are being destroyed on a regular basis. And then finally, we contextualize it for people and tell them and ask them, is it really worth it? Is it really this valuable to get somewhere when we're in an urban environment? 5 miles per hour actually only means 17 seconds to the average commuter. And then we take this beyond and we say that it's not just a program, that Vision Zero is not a program, it's not a project, it's an overall approach. It's the way that you approach an idea and an empathetic way to approach idea. That it's okay that humans aren't perfect, but that if we focus on a systems approach that includes error in how we design and focus on serious and fatal collisions, that we can prevent them in very cost-effective ways. And another way that this is incorporated into the transportation world is when we think about the built environment in urban design. And so this is a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but this is the picture from The Godfather, where we can see that Michael Corleone is having his wedding in the public square. And the public square is literally part of the street. You can see the car right there in the background pulled up behind them. And we're starting to think about this in a more modern context. So cities all over the country are thinking about mobility hubs. And so rather than transportation being focused around people going to a central location like a gas station right now, that is very cold and auto-oriented rather than human and community-oriented, we're thinking about transportation in urban areas being centered around community-centered facilities where people can find their preferred modes in the easiest and most frictionless environment. And we've seen this through the pandemic on a day-to-day basis, where nearly every city in the world has thought about how do we actually maximize our public space in the most human way possible, recognizing that people can't be sitting in their houses all day long, and that we need to get them out of their houses. We need to get them moving. We need to think about their health. We need to think about their overall communities, how they engage with other people, because we can't all just sit in our houses all day long and be on Zoom. And then we go beyond the built environment as well. So we think about this when we talk about technology and big data processes and algorithms, and that they don't account for our idealized values of humanity. What they really do is coldly codify our existing biases. And so this is an example from Seattle, where a study showed that Black Uber riders waited 30% longer than white Uber riders in Seattle. And is this because the app is racist? No, it's because the underlying inequities are institutionalized to the point where, in order to maximize profits, Uber is purposely incentivizing itself to not serve all our communities equitably. And so, again, we think about 2020 and all of the things that we've seen through the pandemic and the continued discussions about policing in communities of color, and how these institutional inequities have played out both through the loss of life in the pandemic and also through our community policing. And one of the things that, again, LADOT has been a leader in is how do we ensure that these cold algorithms are looking at institutional factors. And so it's not that government wants to rewrite the algorithms. It's just we want to make sure that through developing stuff like the mobility data specification and the Open Mobility Foundation, that we can keep companies honest about their algorithms and about the way that they make decisions and about their business models, to maintain our human and community-oriented values. And so with that, I kind of want to spend a few minutes here talking about how we can actually bring tools in to help us make these decisions. And so I'm just going to talk about two things really quickly, because we need to recognize that this isn't simple stuff. It's not that easy. It's incredibly complex because as humans, we're incredibly complex. And we have regular touch points with government on a day-to-day basis in a number of different ways, whether it be transportation, utilities, environment, healthcare, education, social programs, amongst a number of other things. And so one of my favorite things to do when I walk through a design problem is think about design thinking exercises as a way to build empathy into what we're doing. So one of the best exercises for doing this is something called journey mapping, where we put ourselves in the persona of a real person in our community and walk through their needs and interactions on the subject matter that we're trying to analyze on a day-to-day basis. And this works best when we take a universal design approach and think about the most underserved people by our institutions and designing specifically for them. Because when we can design for them, we design for the entire community. Another tool that we've developed at Cityfi and has been talked about at multiple levels of government, and most recently with an executive order by the Biden administration, is looking at the total social cost benefit of making budgetary decisions. So with this tool, what we do is we look at the cost of a project or design feature and analyze numerous options and look at the total return on investment, both from an economic, environmental, equity, happiness, health, safety, and then finally the traditional pure financial perspective to really analyze true community-based return on investment. So what are people and what are we collectively going to see when a city or a government agency makes an investment and decides that they're going to do something? And so with this, what I'll leave you with is another quick story that really focuses on empathy here. In 1968, one of the leaders of the Prague Spring escaped Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia and gained political asylum in America. And this man had a son who ended up studying law. And later on in his life, he became an immigration judge in Cincinnati, Ohio in the 1990s. And so with that, what I want to leave you with is I wish you all good health, and I encourage you all to grab the bull by the horns here and realize that you too, like this judge, if you think from an empathetic perspective about your community's needs, will be able to change lives just like this judge was able to do with me. With that, I thank you and have a good day.